Okay, I'll ask Sarah and Rosie to come up and lead us in our Bible readings, and then our elder Bob French will come and bring us the message for today.
I'll be reading from Romans 8, verses 12 to 25. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, but it is not to the flesh, to live in accordance to it. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not have yet, we wait for it patiently.
I'm reading from Matthew chapter 13, 24 to 30, the parable of the weeds. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds amongst the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seeds in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, First collect the weeds and tie them in bundles so that it to be burnt, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Now chapter 36 to 42, the parable of the weeds explained. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, Let him hear. This is the word of God.
Last Sunday, we read the parable of the sower in Matthew's Gospel. One interpretation of this, which I heartily endorse, is that God intends his gospel message to be spread indiscriminately, far and wide, without fear or favour, and without consideration of the likelihood of its being listened to or not. That's why the sower cast his seed on hard ground, rocky ground, and among the thistles as well as on good ground. It also teaches us that there are many reasons why the message may not take root, but that where it does, it can bear much fruit. We also read the first half of chapter 8 of Paul's letter to the Romans, and Kevin used that to contrast life in the flesh with life in the spirit, and how that springs from the gospel message portrayed in the parable of the sower. Today, we read a related parable, that of the weeds, and we also read the next part of Romans in which Paul elaborates on the implications of living in the Spirit. Jesus was fond of using agricultural allusions in his parables, and they appealed to many of his listeners who made their living from the land. And I'm sure modern farmers relate to them as well. The allegorical interpretation of the parable that Rosie just read to us likens the good seed to the followers of Christ, the bad seed to those who reject him, and the harvest to the final judgment. That seems straightforward enough, but I think there is much more we can learn from the parable. The farmer's servants say to him, "Was it not good seed that you sowed in your field?" And he answers, "This was an enemy's doing." Modern farmers know that contaminated seed is a common way that weeds are spread. That's one of the reasons they take such care in cleaning their seed before planting a crop. Indeed, that's how most of our agricultural weeds came to Australia. Like most of our crops, most of their weeds are not native to Australia, but come from Europe. And before that, from the crop centres of origin, mostly in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East and West Asia. And they come as contaminants of seed and fodder. The Greek word translated weed in Matthew's Gospel is zizanion. Not sure whether that's the right way to say it, but that's the way I'm going to. Which means weed in general in modern Greek. But in ancient Greek, it appeared to refer to a specific weed, which is translated tares in the authorised version of 1611 and darnel in the New English Bible. But these are just different words for the same weed, which was, and still is, an insidious weed resembling annual ryegrass, so beloved by modern Australian farmers. It thrives, the tares or darnel, thrives under the same conditions as wheat and barley, so does annual ryegrass, strangely enough, and seeds at the same time, so it's very difficult to stop it from contaminating seed for the next crop, hence the importance of good seed. And I don't need to tell anyone here that there are other weeds like wild radish and caltrop that, once established, are very, very difficult to eradicate. Hence the importance of clean seed, but also of good farm hygiene to prevent their further spread. So I want to consider whether there is a parallel to seed and farm hygiene that we can learn from here in the context of this parable. I believe we need to be careful about how we engage with modern culture, who we listen to, and who we allow to influence our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviour. For better or worse, we are told that we live in a post-Christian society, so there are many influences that are not particularly productive or worthwhile. When I was young, my father took a great interest in what I read and what was taught at school. I remember him taking a very dim view of some of the books I brought home from the school library, though I can't now remember exactly what it was he objected to in them. But I do remember more clearly his objection to a book on the English curriculum that my brother was given to read, called A Kind of Loving. This was about a young man in the north of England who was forced into an unhappy and ultimately unsuccessful marriage when his somewhat casual girlfriend became pregnant. Dad had the happy knack of being able to open a book exactly at the most questionable part. And so it was in this case when he stumbled upon a not very explicit sex scene, which he objected to, and tried to get the book taken off the school curriculum, without any luck, I might add. But what he was trying to do was to keep his sons from being lured into what Paul in Romans calls the ways of the flesh, and thereby becoming corrupted. My dad was very straight-laced, and this is perhaps an extreme example, but it's worth asking ourselves the question, do we unnecessarily expose ourselves to the influences of the flesh by engaging too closely or too uncritically with the prevailing culture around us, by sowing unclean seed in our lives, as it were? Now, I have to confess that I'm ambivalent about this idea, as you'll see when I try to draw my next lesson from the parable, but perhaps it carries more weight for some people than others. One of the recurring themes throughout Paul's writings is reconciling the Palestinian and Gentile views of Christianity that were around in the first century. Many Jewish Christians in Jerusalem believed that Christians needed to follow Jewish law and customs like circumcision, strict Sabbath observance, and the various dietary regulations. In effect, saying salvation is at least to some extent contingent on our actions. Understandably, this did not go down well with non-Jewish Christians who were not culturally attuned to these customs, and Paul persuasively argues that they are not necessary because salvation comes solely through God's grace, and nothing we can do makes it any more or less likely. But he recognised that some Christians have stronger faith than others. And in Romans chapters 14 and 15, he advised those with a stronger faith not to cause the weaker to stumble by doing things likely to offend them or question their faith. In that context, he was talking about clean and unclean food and drinking wine. But the idea could be extended to other things that I don't really have time to go into here. But the point is that there are some church traditions that arose for very good reasons at the time, but may not be absolutely essential to the faith. But some Christians should be shielded from the unclean seed of worldly influences that are quite safe for stronger Christians. So much for that train of thought. The second lesson I want to draw from the parable of the weeds hinges on the advice the farmer gives his servants on discovering the weeds. It's always puzzled me that he would choose to leave them competing with the crop until harvest. What modern farmer would say, leave the weeds until harvest and separate them then, lest by destroying them you damage the crop? No, we know that small weeds are less damaging than large ones, and as they get bigger, the weeds do more and more damage to the crop. Early weed control is best. And if some damage is done to the crop, as happens with certain herbicides, it's often less than the damage caused by letting the weeds grow unchecked. W.E. Vine, in his Bible dictionary, says it was the custom in ancient times to leave removing the weeds until harvest, as in the parable. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it is true that they didn't have the benefit of selective herbicides like we do, so in those times early weed control would have been trickier. But the principle remains that the longer the weeds stay in the crop, the more they compete with it. But I think there is a very good reason Jesus wanted to leave the weeds there until the last minute. You see, I think there is a very important difference between the weeds in Jesus' story and the weeds in our paddocks. That difference is that the weeds in our paddocks are not crop plants and never will be, whereas the weeds in Jesus' story are fundamentally, at some level, the same as the wheat. Now, I know that some of our modern crop species, like oats and rye, started out as weeds in wheat and barley, but that's another story. But think about it this way. The good seed in the parable, that is, the children of the kingdom, are simply former, and that includes all of us here, are simply former children of the flesh who, in Paul's words, have died to the flesh and now live according to the Spirit. And those of you who were here this morning for David's presentation will remember him talking about the change that happens in people's lives, and people who can point to a specific time when they changed from, when they became a Christian. So that's when they stopped being children of the flesh and became children of the Spirit. Now, the weeds in the parable, or the children of the enemy, still have, and this is the critical point I think, still have the potential to defect, as it were, and die to the flesh and become as the good seed. We believe that it's God's wish that all people come to experience His grace, dying to the flesh and becoming children of God through the leading of the Spirit. You see, the interaction between crops and weeds is not only in one direction. When weeds reduce crop growth by competition, which is bad, but a good, healthy crop will reduce the growth of weeds, which is good. I suggested earlier that one lesson we might take from this parable is to separate ourselves from the world so it doesn't corrupt us. But if we do that, how will the weeds come to know of God's grace and be set upon the road that leads to salvation? Do we have a role in corrupting the weeds? So now I say to you, do not withdraw yourselves from the world, but engage with the people around you. Make your faith known. Make known the hope you have in Christ and why. Interact with them as intimately as weeds and crop plants interact. Elsewhere, Jesus talks of his followers as yeast. Interact as intimately as yeast does with flour in a lump of dough. It may be that because of you, an ugly weed will become a beautiful crop plant before the harvest time, and another slave of the flesh will become an adopted child of God. The Gospel of John tells us that God so loved the world. So if God loved the world, we should do what we can to reconcile it with God by being in it. Just be wary that it doesn't corrupt you in the process.